Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed her arm, pulling her through the chaos. Kamsi looked up and saw a young man, his face set in determination. "Come on," he shouted over the noise. "This way." Kamsi didn't hesitate. She followed him, weaving through the panicked crowd, dodging the police, who were swinging their batons wildly. The young man led her down a side street, away from the chaos. They ran until they were far from the square, the sounds of the protest fading into the distance. Finally, they stopped to catch their breath in a quiet alley. Kamsi's heart was pounding, her body trembling with adrenaline. She turned to the young man who had saved her. "Thank you," she gasped, her voice shaky. He nodded, his expression serious. "It's not safe here," he said. "We need to get out of the city." Kamsi stared at him, confused. "Out of the city? But, where would we go?" "There's a place," he replied, his voice urgent. "A safe place, outside the city, where we can regroup. It's better than staying here." Kamsi hesitated. She had never left the city since she arrived, and the thought of venturing into the unknown was terrifying. But staying here, in this dangerous place, was no longer an option. She had nothing left to lose. "Okay," she said finally, her voice firm. "Let's go." The young man nodded and led the way, his pace quick and purposeful. Kamsi followed, her mind racing. She didn't know what awaited her outside the city, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She had to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep surviving. As they made their way toward the outskirts of the city, Kamsi realized that this was just the beginning. The protest may have been broken up, but the fight was far from over. She was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one filled with danger and uncertainty but also with hope. For the first time in a long time, Kamsi felt alive. The world had tried to break her, but she wasn't broken yet. And as she followed the young man into the unknown, she vowed that she would never stop fighting for her survival, for her future, and for all the girls who had been silenced for too long. But the journey ahead was filled with dangers she couldn't even imagine, dangers that would test her in ways she had never been tested before. And Kamsi would soon discover that the greatest challenges were not just physical but came from within, challenges that would force her to confront her past, her fears, and the darkness that had taken hold of her heart. The sun was beginning to set as Kamsi and the young man reached the outskirts of the city. The towering buildings and crowded streets gave way to dusty roads and sparse, run-down houses. The city was behind them now, but Kamsi could still feel its weight pressing down on her. She could still hear the echoes of the protest, the shouts, the fear, the chaos. Her heart pounded in her chest, a relentless drumbeat of anxiety. The young man led her along a narrow, winding path that seemed to go on forever. They didn't speak much, both were too focused on putting distance between themselves and the city. Kamsi's legs ached, her feet were sore, and her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Who was this young man? Where was he taking her? And most importantly, could she trust him? Finally, they reached a small clearing at the edge of a dense forest. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the fading light of the day. The young man stopped and turned to Kamsi, his expression serious. "We need to rest here for the night," he said, his voice low. "It's too dangerous to travel through the forest in the dark." Kamsi nodded, too tired to argue. She dropped her bag to the ground and sat down, leaning against the trunk of a tree. The young man did the same, sitting a short distance away. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the rustling of the leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. After a while, Kamsi couldn't hold back her curiosity any longer. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the questions that had been swelling in her mind. "And why did you help me?" The young man looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. "My name is Chima," he said. "I was at the protest because I believe in what we were fighting for. When things went wrong, I couldn't just leave people behind." Kamsi nodded slowly, processing his words. There was something about Chima that put her at ease, something that made her want to trust him. But she was still wary. She had learned the hard way that not everyone could be trusted, no matter how kind they seemed. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a safe house in the forest," Chima explained. "It's a place where people like us, people who are fighting against the injustice in the city, can regroup and plan our next moves. You'll be safe there." Kamsi's heart skipped a beat. A safe house. It sounded almost too good to be true. But then again, nothing in her life had been safe for a long time. The thought of finding a place where she could rest, even for a little while, was tempting. But what happens after that? Kamsi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do next?" Chima sighed, his gaze distant. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But we can't go back to the way things were. We have to keep fighting and keep pushing for change. We can't let fear control us." Kamsi looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a way out of this darkness. But the memories of the past few months weighed heavily on her, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep going. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she whispered, her voice filled with doubt. Chima turned to her, his expression softening. "You are stronger than you know, Kamsi," he said gently. "You've survived things that would break most people. But strength isn't just about what you can endure. It's about finding the will to keep going, even when everything seems hopeless." His words struck a chord deep within Kamsi. She thought about her mother's last words, the way she had urged her to survive. Kamsi had taken that to mean enduring whatever came her way, no matter how painful. But maybe Chima was right. Maybe survival was about more than just enduring, it was about fighting for something better, for a future that wasn't defined by the horrors of the past. As the night deepened, Kamsi and Chima settled down to sleep. The ground was hard and uncomfortable, and the darkness of the forest was unsettling, but Kamsi found herself drifting off, her mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. She dreamed of her parents, of her village, of the life she had lost. But in the dream, she was running, always running, through a forest that seemed to have no end. She woke suddenly, her heart pounding, the echoes of her dream still lingering in her mind. It was still dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moon that peeked through the trees. She glanced at Chima, who was asleep nearby, his breathing steady and calm. Kamsi felt a strange mix of fear and determination welling up inside her. She was afraid of what lay ahead, of the unknown dangers that awaited her in the forest and beyond. But she was also determined not to give up, not to let the darkness consume her. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Kamsi stood up, stretching her sore muscles. Chima woke up as well, and they shared a quick, silent breakfast of the meager food they had brought with them. Then, without a word, they began their journey into the forest. The forest was dense and shadowy, the air thick with the scent of earth and leaves. The trees were ancient and towering, their branches forming a tangled web overhead. As they walked, Kamsi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the forest itself was alive, its eyes following their every move. She kept close to Chima, her senses on high alert. After hours of walking, they finally arrived at the safe house. It was a small, weathered cabin, hidden deep within the forest. It looked abandoned, the wood darkened by age and the windows boarded up. But Chima assured Kamsi that it was safe. Inside, the cabin was dim and musty, but it was warm, and there were supplies, food, water, blankets. Kamsi felt a wave of relief wash over her as she sank onto a makeshift bed in the corner. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. But the relief was short-lived. As she settled into the cabin, Kamsi couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her that something was off. She glanced at Chima, who was busy securing the cabin, but he seemed oblivious to her unease. That night, as Kamsi tried to sleep, she was plagued by nightmares. She saw shadows moving in the darkness and heard whispers that sent chills down her spine. When she woke, drenched in sweat, the cabin felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on her. She tried to calm herself, to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave her. Then, in the dead of night, she heard it, a faint rustling outside the cabin. Kamsi's heart leaped into her throat. She lay still, straining to hear, her mind racing with fear. The rustling grew louder, closer. Someone, or something, was outside. Kamsi sat up, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She glanced at Chima, who was still asleep. She wanted to wake him, to tell him what she had heard, but something held her back. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing her. She could only sit there, frozen, as the rustling grew louder and louder, until it was right outside the door. And then there was a knock. Kamsi's blood ran cold. She didn't move, didn't breathe, her mind racing with terror. Who could it be? What did they want? The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Kamsi forced herself to move, to reach out and shake Chima awake. He stirred, blinking in confusion, but before he could say anything, the door burst open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness outside. Kamsi couldn't see their faces, but she could feel the menace radiating from them. She scrambled back, her heart pounding, as the figure stepped into the cabin, the door swinging shut behind them. Chima, the figure said, their voice low and cold. It's time. Kamsi's eyes widened in shock as she realized that Chima knew this person, knew them well enough to have expected them. Her fear turned to confusion, then to anger. What was going on? Who was this person? And what did they want with her? Chima stood up slowly, his face tense. Kamsi, he said, his voice strained, this is something I didn't want you to see. The figure stepped forward, and Kamsi finally saw their face. It was a woman, tall and imposing, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. There was something in her expression that made Kamsi's blood turn to ice. You've done well, Chima, the woman said, her voice dripping with a strange mix of approval and cruelty. But the girl is coming with me now. Kamsi's mind reeled. What was happening? Why was this woman here? And why was she talking about Kamsi like she was some kind of prize? Chima's face twisted with something that looked like guilt, but before Kamsi could process what was happening, the woman grabbed her arm, her grip like iron. Kamsi struggled, but the woman was too strong. Let go of me. Kamsi cried, her voice shaking with fear and anger. But the woman didn't respond. She just tightened her grip, pulling Kamsi toward the door. Chima. Kamsi screamed, her heart pounding in her chest. Help me. But Chima just stood there, his face a mask of regret and helplessness. I'm sorry, Kamsi, he said, his voice barely audible. I didn't have a choice. And with that, Kamsi was dragged out of the cabin, her screams echoing through the dark forest as she was pulled into the night, her fate more uncertain than ever before. Kamsi's heart raced as the woman dragged her deeper into the dark, shadowy forest. The towering trees loomed above, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The night was alive with eerie sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft, menacing whispers of the wind. Fear coursed through Kamsi's veins, but she forced herself to stay alert. She needed to think, to find a way out of this terrifying situation. The woman's grip was unyielding, her pace relentless. Kamsi stumbled along behind her, trying to gather her thoughts, to understand what was happening. Who was this woman? Why was Chima involved? And where were they taking her? Where are you taking me? Kamsi demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. The woman didn't respond, her expression cold and unyielding. Kamsi felt a wave of frustration and fear, but she refused to give up. She tried to pull away, to free herself from the woman's grasp, but it was no use. The woman's grip was like steel, unbreakable. As they moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the shadows thicker. The path they were on was narrow and winding, barely visible in the dim light. Kamsi's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She had to do something, anything, to escape. Suddenly, they reached a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone structure, ancient and foreboding. It was a small temple, covered in moss and vines, its walls cracked and crumbling with age. Kamsi had never seen anything like it before. The woman stopped in front of the temple and turned to Kamsi, her eyes gleaming with a strange light. "This is where it begins," she said, her voice low and menacing. "Begins? What begins?" Kamsi asked, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she pulled Kamsi toward the entrance of the temple. The doors creaked as they opened, revealing a dark, cavernous space inside. Kamsi hesitated, fear clawing at her insides, but the woman's grip tightened, forcing her forward. Inside the temple, the air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The walls were lined with strange, ancient symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The floor was cold and uneven beneath Kamsi's feet. She could barely see, the only light coming from the moon that filtered through cracks in the ceiling. The woman led Kamsi to the center of the temple, where a large stone altar stood. The altar was covered in strange carvings, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. Kamsi's heart pounded as she realized what this place was, a place of sacrifice. "Why are you doing this?" Kamsi cried, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" Kamsi cried, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The woman finally looked at her, her eyes cold and calculating. "You're special, Kamsi," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have something that we need. Something that can't be found in anyone else." Kamsi's mind raced. Special. What could she possibly have that these people wanted? She was just a girl, alone and afraid, with nothing left to give. But the woman's words sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger, something she didn't understand. Before Kamsi could say anything, the woman turned and walked to the far end of the temple, where a large stone basin sat, filled with a dark, shining liquid. She dipped her hand into the basin, her fingers full of the liquid, in a slow, deliberate motion. As she did, the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, filling the temple with an eerie, pulsating light. Kamsi watched in horror as the woman began to chant in a language she didn't understand. The air around them grew thick with energy, crackling with a strange, otherworldly power. Kamsi could feel it pulsing through her, making her skin tingle and her heart race. She tried to move, to run, but her body felt heavy, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The woman turned back to Kamsi, her eyes glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. "You were chosen, Kamsi," she said, her voice reverberating through the temple. "Chosen to be the vessel. Chosen to carry the burden. Chosen." Kamsi echoed, her voice barely audible. "For what?" "For the spirit of the forest," the woman replied, her voice filled with an eerie reverence. "A power as old as time itself, a power that can shape the world. It has slumbered for centuries, waiting for the right vessel, the right moment. And now, it has chosen you." Kamsi's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. It sounded like something out of a nightmare, or a story told to frighten children. But the fear in her heart told her that this was real, horribly, terrifyingly real. "No!" Kamsi cried, her voice rising in desperation. "I don't want this. I don't want to be a vessel." The woman's expression didn't change. "It's not about what you want, Kamsi. It's about what must be done." Before Kamsi could react, the woman reached out and placed her hand on Kamsi's forehead. The touch was icy cold, sending a shock through Kamsi's body. She gasped, her vision blurring, as a surge of energy flowed through her, filling her with a strange, overwhelming power. The world around her began to spin, the temple walls warping and twisting as if they were alive. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their light blinding. Kamsi could feel the power inside her growing and expanding until it felt like she would burst. She screamed, but no sound came out, her voice lost in the maelstrom of energy swirling around her. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The energy vanished, leaving Kamsi feeling empty, hollow. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling. The temple was silent, the glowing symbols dimming until they were just faint marks on the walls. The woman knelt beside her, her expression unreadable. "It is done," she said softly. "The spirit has awakened within you." Kamsi didn't respond. She could barely think, her mind numb with shock and fear. She could feel something inside her, something foreign and terrifying, a presence that wasn't there before. It was like a shadow in her mind, whispering to her, filling her with dread. The woman stood up, her eyes never leaving Kamsi. "You must come with us now," she said. "There is much to be done. The spirit will guide you, but you must be prepared. The world is changing, and you will be at the center of it." Kamsi looked up at the woman, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me? Why did you do this to me?" The woman's expression softened, just for a moment. "Because you have the strength to bear it, Kamsi. The strength to survive, to endure. The spirit chose you because it saw something in you that no one else has, the will to survive, no matter the cost." Kamsi shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She didn't feel strong. She felt broken, lost, terrified. But deep down, she knew that the woman was right. She had survived things that would have destroyed others. She had endured pain, loss, and fear, and she was still standing. But this was different. This was something beyond her control, something that had been forced upon her. And she didn't know if she could survive it. The woman reached out and helped Kamsi to her feet. "Come," she said, her voice gentle. "There is someone you need to meet. Someone who can help you understand what has happened." Kamsi hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't trust this woman, didn't trust any of them. But what choice did she have? She could feel the spirit inside her, pulsing with a dark, ancient power. She couldn't go back to her old life, couldn't pretend that this hadn't happened. She had to move forward, had to find a way to survive. So, with a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, Kamsi followed the woman out of the temple and into the darkness of the forest, not knowing where the path would lead, but knowing that her life would never be the same. Kamsi and the woman walked in silence through the dense forest, the darkness pressing in around them. The path they followed was narrow and winding, barely visible in the faint light of the moon. Kamsi's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. The presence of the spirit inside her was overwhelming, like a constant whisper in the back of her mind, reminding her that nothing would ever be the same again. The woman led her deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and more twisted as they went. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and Kamsi could hear the distant calls of nocturnal animals echoing through the trees. She felt like she was walking through a nightmare, every step taking her further away from the world she knew. After what felt like hours, they reached another clearing. This one was larger than the first, the ground covered in a thick layer of moss that glowed faintly in the moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of ancient stone pillars, each one carved with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. At the center of the circle, a fire burned, its flames a strange, unnatural shade of blue.
I hope you enjoyed the tale. If so, please like the video, comment, share it with your family and friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Goodbye.